Welcome back to Sika Strength and welcome back to S&C Coaches React. Today we're doing Lieke Klaver, who is a Dutch athlete. She is a teammate of Femke Bull, who we did the other week. Now, Lieke is a 400 meter runner, 200 meter runner, and 400 meter relay runner. She was an Olympian at the 2021 Olympics in Tokyo, and she is a numerous world finalist, international medalist, so an incredibly high caliber athlete. And as we did Femke just 2 weeks ago, it seemed apt to continue on with some of those members of that Dutch team for their S&C. And thankfully, Lieke has quite a few videos. Now, it does bear saying just before we start, because the comments do happen, is that we're not telling Mrs. Klaver what she should do with her training. We're just using her training as an example of what people who don't have elite international coaches coaching them to do in their own S&C. So we can use this as an example, put context on things, what they might be useful for, so you can get some ideas for your training and then decide what you might need to do or might not need to do based on our recommendations from that. So even though I say this every time, we still get comments being like, yeah, nice to see you.
Yeah, that's actually not why she's doing that.
You don't know what she wants to do. I think she wants to win the Olympics is her goal. So with that being said, obviously it's a teaching exercise and education, not a video for Lieke. I'm sure that's incorrect pronunciation. To go watch and change. We're not recommending that at all. So first up, we've got some hang power cleans at 110 kilo. So using a men's bar in this, and this is an absolutely outrageous weight for a track and field athlete to be doing, especially someone who competes in the 400 meters. So maybe we might see a 60, 100 kilometer sprinter, but someone in that 200 meter plus doing something like this is crazy. So the really interesting thing about this is not particularly that she's using a hang power clean, it's that the weight she's getting up to in the hang power clean is very, very interesting. And there's a lot that can be talked about in relation to how heavy should you go, what does meaningful working weights mean in the sports of track and field, and you're trying to use the Olympic lifts as a variation to improve your capacity for your sport. So the goal is, or the golden standard, and this sounds really idealistic and this is kind of what you're working towards, but it doesn't always play out. And the gold standard is that you want to get as heavy as possible. Now that might sound kind of silly, it might sound almost redundant. It's like saying maybe you should just run faster in your track and field. But the idea is that if we can get as heavy as possible with the Olympic lifts, and it doesn't injure us, it doesn't impact our other S&C training, and more importantly, it doesn't impact our sport-specific training. So in some cases, for some athletes, that might literally be a double bodyweight hang power clean within the first 4 years of late teenage years or early adulthood, when they're really hitting home and they're kind of hitting their kind of almost second puberty, where they're coming through in training, they're developing muscle strength, tendon strength and elasticity, and then they're able to hit those bigger numbers. Or for some athletes, it might be 10 years of training and they can barely hit 1.2 times body weight, and then that's as much as you can hit. The important thing there is to look at them and let it play into those other variables. So you're looking at how much can I do in the off season? How heavy can I do this in the in season? How good is my technique? How safe am I being? How good is my coach at coaching the Olympic lifts, or how good am I coaching the Olympic lifts for myself? And then, does it seem feasible? Have I gotten to that? Let's say you're a 100 kilo athlete and you've gotten to 140 in a hang power clean already, and you're like, yeah, 160 in 4 years time seem incredibly feasible with some smart off season training. Or are you 100 kilos and you're barely doing 100 kilo power cleans from the floor now? So it just bears looking at what your capacities are. Is it amazing if we could do a double bodyweight power clean? Absolutely. But is that realistic? No. Now, the second lift we've got, our second variation of the Olympic lifts in the power clean from Lieke, is the block power clean. Now, the block power clean isn't really much different in regards to the hang power clean when you're looking to use in your training. Really, the big preference here is your personal preference when it comes to using the variations. We're still moving the weight over a certain distance. Yes, you do get some kind of the stretch shortening cycle activated when you're going down in the eccentric portion of the hang power clean, but it's, by and large, it's not a crazy difference. You're still getting that stretch shortening cycle, and you're still getting the main goal of the Olympic lifts, which is that contraction, relaxing of the muscles, and then contracting again in the block power clean. So that's not a major difference, although the hang power clean can be quite useful. The blocking can be as equally useful. What I want to talk about specifically here in this technical position she's achieving in the block power clean is her upper back extension and tightness. So this is something that is a gold standard for weightlifting. It's incredibly important for you to be able to utilize your lower body and stay in a good position through the extension and the pull of the hang power clean is your thoracic extension, or in combination with that, your lower back extension, and your ability to maintain your shoulders in a rigid position. And this is without a doubt the best position I've seen any track and field athlete hit outside of weightlifting, obviously, not track and field of course, but in regards to athletes doing S&C. This is the best upper back position. This is a position I'm trying to work towards in my own snatching at the moment. You'll see how well she sets her shoulders. They don't move as she begins pulling, so we don't see this forward moving or vertical raising of the shoulders. Her upper back extension is immaculate, and it's set incredibly rigidly as she begins pulling, and this allows us to use our lower body incredibly well, and it maintains a very strong rigid position throughout the body. And so then hopefully you can move the weight faster and hopefully move a heavier weight faster. So here's an older video of her a couple of years ago at a lighter body weight. You can see even then that extension is an incredibly good position there. So as long as the shoulders are at least on top of the barbell, but preferably in front of the barbell before it starts from the blocks or in the hang power clean, is the best position to be in.
So up next here we have a video of Lieke doing a clean or power clean complex. Now, as Owen was saying, there's a myriad of things that the power clean is useful for developing speed, developing strength. Obviously, we have certain variations that we've seen, like the power clean versus full clean, or the clean from blocks, or power clean from the blocks, or clean from the floor. Now, in this case, all the weightlifters watching will be very familiar with the use of a complex. So this is a combination of a number of variations or derivatives of the lift. So maybe it's one clean from the floor plus one hang clean, or in this case, we've got high hang clean, mid hang clean, and low hang clean in the same complex. Now, when we're coming from weightlifting, we're usually using complexes to make up for a certain deficit or to allow us to attain a certain skill. So let's just say the very common one will be one pull plus one clean. And this will be making sure people go the whole way through their pull, making sure they're hitting the right positions along the pull, and then when they go to do the clean immediately afterwards, they've just achieved the correct position, so it's easier for them to clean with the correct technique. Now, in the case of a track and field athlete, or more appropriately, a non-weightlifting athlete, the complex takes on a different use. So when we have athletes and we're getting them to do a complex, what we're usually doing is some sort of facilitator. So it might be a case like in this where we have 3 high and 3 low on the hang cleans. It might be a case where doing 6 hang cleans in a row, all from that low hang clean position, is slightly too much load. Maybe the capacity of the athlete to maintain the positions isn't there. Maybe they're not able to do it with a heavy enough weight, or maybe the speed is just too slow when we do all 6 with the full range of motion. So in this case, we can get 3 from a high hang position, a relatively easier position, or for many athletes, an easier position to attain, and then 3 from the slightly lower position. So we're still getting a good usable weight there. We're still getting really good barbell speed and movement speed on all of them. And we're still achieving some of that slightly more difficult position. So it is just a very, very good training tool if you're a thrower, if you're a track and field athlete, to be able to do something like this, to be able to bring in some variations in the same complex. You're getting a lot of good work done with valuable weights, but not necessarily taxing ourselves or pulling ourselves into non-ideal positions. The next thing then about complexes, and this is really in the general phase of training or the prep phase of training, is it allows us to accumulate a lot of work capacity. So what we're doing in a complex is we're adding multiple derivatives or multiple variations of a lift together. Oftentimes we might have some squats in between, so it might be clean front squat push press, clean front squat push press, and we're building up an awful lot of work capacity in those phases. So in the case where we were just to use the traditional version of the lift or a single derivative of the lift, we won't accumulate the same kind of work or the same total working volume in the actual sets themselves as we would if we were doing it in a single complex or a continuous stream of movement. So that's a really common case for the use of complexes in the prep phase of athletes. They're not as commonly used in the peaking phases, where instead of doing a long complex like this, we might simply just do a heavy power clean double.
So next up, we've got a clip of Lieke doing some hip thrusts, so barbell hip thrusts, quite a common exercise, but it's one that we actually don't particularly like. Now, obviously, when we're doing these S&C reacts, we're not here to rag on anyone, but in this particular case, it is worth talking about because it does feature quite heavily. It's a very, very popular exercise, and the barbell hip thrust is just something I'd say almost never recommend. Now, we recommend some variations for that in certain circumstances, but when it comes to straightforward, large-scale S&C training, the barbell hip thrust just doesn't feature. So when we're looking at the hip thrust, we're looking at some hip flexion and some hip extension training, and it doesn't really train them that as well as compared to other exercises. When we're looking for the barbell hip thrust, we're seeing quite a small range of motion. We're looking at a huge amount of weight to make it a meaningful or useful exercise for a lot of people. You can see people who could probably not even squat body weight to full depth, do some stupid heavy weights on the barbell hip thrust. So then we're looking at that case from an S&C point of view, and we're looking at an athlete and we're thinking, okay, can we do a lighter exercise with more range of motion, get more or better stimulus on the hip flexors, some hip extension, and on the glutes? And we're looking at the back squat, we're looking at the stiff-legged RDL or stiff-legged deadlift. And then really when we're looking at the barbell hip thrust, we're seeing a huge amount of weight, not a great position. Sometimes it's kind of unsafe or annoying to set up. So there isn't really a major benefit from it from a safety point of view, which is always a concern as an S&C coach, is how can I keep this athlete safe and make sure that they are ready to play their sport. The last thing you want to do as an S&C coach is injure your elite athlete. So in that case, we're not getting an amazing training effect. We can get a better training effect, in our opinion, if you use full range of motion squats or whatever that allows or possible for that athlete as deep as we can get, generally in something in a high bar squat. And then when we do something like the RDL or stiff-legged deadlift, we're getting just as good glute activation. We're getting hamstrings involved over a much greater range of motion. And then we're getting those posterior muscles involved in the upper body as well. So we're hitting a bit more bang for our buck. Now, where we do use the kind of hip thrust or bridge variations is oftentimes single leg glute bridge holds. And if you look at some of the muscular activation data in the research, you'll see greater glute activation in the hip thrust hold, but not much difference in a squat versus a barbell hip thrust. So if we see 60 kilo holds at the bottom of a squat versus a 60 kilo hold with that glute bridge, we get a better activation with that glute bridge on the hold, but not on the full lift. So that's very important to mind. So what's really happening there is that hip position at the top. We're not quite in full hip extension, but we're getting there. When we're looking at full hip extension, we're looking at that knee behind the hip. So at the top of a glute bridge, we might getting slightly more depending on our mobility. So in that case, some glute bridge holds as an assistance work, single leg glute bridge holds in particular, one we use quite frequently. Some weighted single leg glute bridge holds are often used then as parts of training as assistance work, are very, very useful. But the main exercise, that barbell hip thrust, just doesn't feature quite frequently.
So up next then, and the next one in this same training session, is some very heavy box squats to above parallel. So this is obviously a massive bone of contention. There's a huge amount of debate online here whether we're better off doing our above parallel squats to a box or even just not to parallel squats, some what people might call high squats, versus full range of motion ass to grass squats. Now, here we have a lot of athletes doing the full range of motion high bar squats. It's generally what we use as the kind of go-to tool. But in the case of an athlete like this, where they're probably in season, this is probably their second session of the day, and we still want to get a very large bipedal loading onto them or into them, the use of a high box squat is actually very, very beneficial. So in this case, right, what we're looking for is a massive amount of central nervous system stimulation. We want them to be driving as hard as possible, shooting as many neurotransmitters down their spinal column as they possibly can. And in the case where we can put a heavy barbell on their back, get them squatting safely to above parallel, get some valuable work rate in there, so an amount of volume that's not insignificant. This allows us to do that without absolutely destroying the athlete. So in the case you have somebody in training camp, maybe they're in season, maybe they have a few weeks or a month or so in between a race, the use of that high bar squat to a box above parallel is actually really useful. Now, is it something you want to do all year round? Probably not. You'll probably get a better stimulus from full range of motion, not necessarily ass to grass, but full range of motion for you squats with maybe a slightly lighter weight at slightly higher volumes. But this all comes down to just sensible periodization. Most track and field athletes in their off season will be running through slightly larger or slightly longer ranges of motion with their squats, in the same way where they'll be pushing the weights a small bit more on the other exercises. And then we get in season using something like this, a very heavy load being done very quickly, is actually really, really beneficial. Now, the last thing that's worth talking about on this variation of the box squat is the fact that it's paused in the bottom. So people who are used to powerlifting, or maybe you've seen some of the West Side barbell stuff, there's a really good documentary on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, go and watch it. You'll see them box squatting to parallel, and they kind of rock back on the box. So they'll go from this engaged position, very nice slide forward, torso lean, their back is engaged, their glutes are engaged, their quads are engaged on the ground. Then they sit on the box, they kind of rock back, and then they rock forward, engage again, and go. That's really not advised for any athlete. For powerlifters, if you're just specifically doing the box squat, that's a whole other thing. We won't get into that now. But in this case, we see Lieke doing the perfect version. She drops down. There's no large impact with the tailbone onto the box. There's no loss of position once she sits down. So you don't see her taking a break and sitting there. But also the pause is just long enough where she has to really hold that position and then drive up again. The last thing is people talk about why do sprinters or why do runners actually need to squat that heavy. We look at the absolute variables that matter for sprinting. The absolute strength they have, the 1RM strength they have, is so utterly important. So moving away from the strength training now for a sec, what we have here is some kind of max wattage or max work output testing. Commonly seen here would be something like a Wingate test, but basically what you're doing is seeing the max amount of work. So work is, or power is the amount of work you can do, or the rate at which work can be done. So in this case, you get them on the bike, you get them to push as hard as possible. In the case of a Wingate, it's 30 seconds with a very specific loading on the front wheel of the bike erg, and they push as hard as they possibly can. Now, the noteworthy thing here is when you see athletes doing this kind of work, this is a test. So the test only works if the athlete goes as hard as humanly possible. It only works if they put in that effort on every single time. So maybe it's off season, midway through their pre-season, then as they start their season, maybe they do one in the middle of the season and one at the end of the season. You're talking about a maximum of 4 to 6 test points over the course of the season here. And it's really important for the repeatability of the test that they go this hard. Now, I'm saying all of this to tee up the notion that every session you do is not this hard. Every time you get on a watt bike to do your work capacity pieces, every time you're doing your 400 meter repeats, every time you're doing your volume work in the gym, it is not this hard. Most training won't see athletes going to this level of exertion. Obviously, training is hard. Good athletes train very, very hard, but we don't see this every day. We probably don't even see this every month.
So for you as an athlete, testing points and data are very, very useful, whether that's a watt bike, whether it is weight on the barbell, maybe it's a velocity meter on your barbell. Any number of things can be used as data points. Using a watt bike as a way of testing is useful, but not absolutely necessary. In some ways, as an athlete, the more data you have, and if you can interpret it correctly, the more useful it can be. You just don't have to go crazy with that data. In effect, your S&C training and the progress on your S&C training, the progress on the weight on the barbell, the quality of the movement, how good it feels, how good your conditioning feels, if the times are improving, if the amount of work done per given time frame is improving, then you know that you're improving there. And that's all data in itself. This is just more of a specific isolated event where you're getting hopefully a little bit more of an objective piece of data for your own peace of mind and your own knowledge. So you're using something that is consistent throughout the months and the years and the seasons, so you can look back and be very, very confident that you're either improving or you're staying the same, or hopefully not, is you are regressing. But you can also do that with your hang power clean triple. You can do that with your hang power clean single. You can do that with your 1RM back squat. You can do that for your, obviously, your event times. Any number of things can be done. A mile time, 200 meter time, anything can be used as a data point as long as you're recording it and you're recording it under an objective kind of point of view. So it doesn't necessarily have to be power or watts on a particular bike here. It can be anything, but the more of them you have and the more diligent you are with that, hopefully the more rigorous you can be with your own training and be really objective if you're improving. Because sometimes if you're in that off season and you're a 400 meter runner, you're not going to be in good 400 meter shape. So you do, hopefully for peace of mind, but also ultimately for the results on the track, you need to be able to see are things progressing throughout that season. So maybe you might do this 3 times throughout the off season, maybe at the start, the middle and the end, or some other event, and you can see, okay, in the middle it's improving from the start, and I can see that start was improved on maybe better the end of last off season, or maybe even the least better than the start of the last off season. So you're hopefully gathering this large amount of data over your career over several years And hopefully it's going the right direction or the right trajectory for you.
So what we have here is some basic core work that's being brought to a very high level of intensity. So I challenge you right now, if you're watching this on your phone, put your phone on the floor. If you're watching it on your TV, hop down off the couch and get into this extended, maybe whatever you call it, Superman plank, starfish plank, whatever it is, and hold this. Try and hold it for 15 seconds. Try and hold it for 30 seconds. This is a very, very difficult thing to do, particularly when they are extended out as far as the two athletes are here. Now, for running, we always hear, for sports generally, we always hear everything works around the core. The core is the most important thing. Core training is what we should be doing. And it doesn't hold true in any sport more than it holds true in running. That maximal running efficiency, when we're trying to maintain that top speed for as long as we possibly can, is so utterly dependent on our ability to maintain good torso positions, stop that rotation or work hard in anti-rotation, and make sure we're not breaking down and getting all of these inefficient movement schemes in there. So absolutely vital. I would challenge you right now to hop down and try this movement. Moving on from that, then we have a more advanced core piece. So it's interesting, we had an isometric hold at the start, although that intensity level on the isometric hold is very, very high. The difficulty rating of that isometric hold is very high. But what we generally see is when we bring athletes in and they're starting their training periods, we always start with isometrics, and then we'll bring up the relative difficulty or intensity of those isometrics. So in the case where it's a runner coming in, maybe they haven't done a lot of gym work before, they'd start on their elbows for a plank, then slowly move towards that extended plank we saw Lieke doing just here. And then we move on to these more concentric, eccentrically loaded, moving through a full range of motion. It's interesting, even here we have a kind of combination of both, where we have an isometric hold and a kind of quasi Palov press where she's also holding this fully extended position, but then we have some need for eccentric and concentric contractions due to the fact that the coach is pulling her out to the side on those. So core work has never been more valuable. I don't think anybody disagrees with us on this. It is something that you absolutely cannot be leaving until the last 10 minutes of your session each time, particularly if you find your running efficiency is dropping off, or whatever your sport is. If you find you're dropping off towards the end of the performance, maybe it's in your training session and you're a thrower and you find that towards the end of the session your numbers are dropping down, or maybe you're a rugby player and your work capacity is really falling off towards the end, obviously you need to be doing direct specific conditioning work for that, but also look at your core, see if that kind of mechanics or those mechanics are breaking down, and this could be the solution for you.
So next up, we've got some single leg deficit RDL. So this is kind of what we're talking about in regards to hamstring and glute activation and use and training compared to that hip thrust. And then on top of that, then we've got the unilateral variation or single leg training compared to bilateral. Obviously, as runners are running and they're on one leg at a time, it is super important to have unilateral training. Unilateral training is something that features across all sports, all S&C. Most S&C looks a lot more similar to each other than it does look very, very different. And if anyone's trying to sell you, just as a point of contention or just a little deviation from the video for a second, if anyone's trying to sell you some super specific S&C for your sport, you should be raising some red flags and think, hey, this isn't really what most sports do. So unless they're producing tons of athletes, and even in that case, you just need to be a little bit cautious. But back to the video, looking at the single leg RDLs, single leg training is obviously an absolute no-brainer. So in regards to performance and injury risk, there is some mounting evidence and some increasing evidence that too large an asymmetry from side to side is not great for your chances of injury and, of course, your quality of training. So it's kind of a no-brainer if you think about it. If one leg is much weaker outside a massive percentage, your running just isn't going to be slower. When you run on that weaker leg, you're not going to be able to apply as much force, as much coordination into the ground, and as a result, your total time is going to be reduced. Now, the idea in terms of injury, the speculation is that if one side is weaker, it's taking less of the load, and oftentimes we see the pain present in the stronger side. Now, pain science is quite interesting, and obviously we're not going to go into it in this video, but the idea is that if you are able to close those asymmetries, you don't have to be super neurotic about it, you don't have to stop all your training to bring those asymmetries exactly the same, but if we're in a place where one side you can do 40, 45 kilo RDLs, and the other side you're able to do 80 kilo RDLs, it's probably worth going, okay, there's some major issue here. It's best to hedge my bets and bring that gap a little bit closer together. Now, one tip, we get asked this question a lot, but in regards to having a bit of a discrepancy from side to side in regards to unilateral, do I just use the heavier weight on the better side and do the lighter weight on the worse side? And the answer here is we prefer to limit by your weaker side, just to ensure that that large discrepancy doesn't start increasing more. So if you've one side where you can do, again, 40, 50 and 70, 80 on the other side, it is just go for that weaker side. Your stronger side will still get trained. It's a stronger side for a reason. It'll maintain its benefits for sure. As you're training it, it will increase as well. So hopefully we can bridge those gaps a little bit. And of course, single leg RDL, fantastic hip coordination exercise, glute and hamstrings used very, very well. The deficit is quite good. If you have that thoracic control and that lower back control, like we see Lieke doing,
Lieke.
like we see Lieke doing, then you can definitely add in that deficit and you can go even further if needed. You can do them obviously bilateral if you want and increase that weight, and it can be very, very useful. But a lot of people don't have this lower back, hip and upper back control and coordination like we see Lieke using here. So it is great if you can get to that deficit, so if you can increase that range of motion, and it's great to see her using the extended range of motion. But a lot of people, for example myself included, wouldn't be able to keep that level of coordination in their lower back and upper back with a deficit on RDLs. So here, the last thing we've in regards to the strength training in the gym is a hang power snatch. Now, the hang power snatch is a variation that can be used for track and field athletes. It's not something we see used a lot. But again, in this case, in regards to Liike's upper back control, we can see that she's very good overhead position, which is not something we see frequently in track and field athletes. And it's one of the reasons we don't really see track and field athletes use the hang power snatch or the hang snatch, is because it's just quite a difficult exercise to use compared to that hang power clean. Now, in regards to the speeds we get in the hang power snatch, we actually see faster barbell speeds compared to the hang power clean. So it might be worth looking at the hang power snatch in your events, or maybe in your sport that you might need to use the hang power snatch. But generally, people can move the hang power clean or the block power clean at speeds fast enough at weights that are heavier compared to the hang power snatch to get loads of great benefits. So much so that we're actually seeing more benefit from the hang power cleans because we've crossed that threshold of speed. The hang power clean is certainly fast enough compared to the hang power snatch that we don't really need to go, okay, we're getting 0.2 meters per second faster in the hang power snatch. We're getting a little bit slower in the hang power clean, but we're using vastly more weight. We could be using 30, 40, 50, 60 kilos, depending on how good an athlete is at the hang power clean or the block power clean or the power clean from the floor. We might be seeing a massive discrepancy, and that extra weight is so much more beneficial compared to that hang power snatch that it's not really worth thinking about that slight loss in speed. Last thing I want to talk about in this is quite an older video. So this is 312 weeks ago. So this is just about 4 years ago. This is before Lieke made the Olympics. And one very important thing I think we want to talk about here that we've talked about a lot for athletes is if you look at the body composition and muscle mass available to her. So this would have been still in her early 20s. So she's certainly not, a very early teenager here. She's a senior athlete. In her, I think she would have been 20 or 21 at this stage, and we can see that she has a lot more or significantly more muscle mass at a very similar or maybe even less body fat percentage in later years than some of those other videos. And this is something we talk about a lot in regards to essentially maximizing as much muscle mass as you can have in your frame while minimizing the fat mass to a healthy and sustainable level. Of course, then the idea comes in though is that we don't want to be too heavy for running. We kind of have this payload scenario or payload analogy where eventually we've so much mass that effort goes into just moving that mass, and we're not really getting a good power to weight ratio in regards to our track and field or our running or our sport or a gym or whatever we're doing. So it's worth bearing in mind that you as an individual do need to be conscious of your weight, but that body comp is very, very important. And hopefully after a certain point you're increasing your lean mass, maybe keeping your body fat percentage the same, maybe reducing it depending on how diligent and how possible that is for you. But hopefully over the years we're seeing a little bit more muscle mass. That could literally be half a kilo of lean mass over 3 years for an athlete, which is incredibly useful. Lean mass, of course, is the contractile tissue. It's doing most of the work, and the more of that you have while not impacting your power to weight ratio massively, hopefully you are getting a better outcome on your sport.
So finally then we have some pieces from a track session. Now, this is interesting. We're obviously not going to comment on the direct sprint technique work here, but in terms of the power production work, we see two specific pieces. So the first one here is a sled push. Most athletes, or most of you, if you're playing a sport, will have done sled pushes, probably as part of a conditioning piece. But when we look at sprinters using them, we see a couple of areas why they might be using them. So the first piece is the same as why every other athlete is using them. Obviously, work capacity. They're building that lactate threshold. They're building that work capacity. They're able to output more force for longer. It's a great thing to use. It's why everyone uses them. The second thing we could be seeing here, though, is a bias towards that acceleration phase of the run, being able to stay in that length over position, driving with the legs for longer, having those slightly larger and longer ground contact times. Now, what we also see here is a harness being used and some sled drags. This is almost certainly what the sled drags are being used for, is for that acceleration period, forcing yourself into that incline forward position, forcing those longer ground contact times and those larger amounts of force being imparted for each step. It's interesting, if you have done a lot of these, you will have felt the feeling of that kind of burning in the legs, and you do have to work incredibly hard to be able to maintain those positions. We see it really commonly with athletes who mightn't necessarily have a lot of sprinting experience, but still need to be faster, like soccer players, rugby players, football players. When they start getting some sprint specific training in, they actually start rising up far too early. So they'll start sprinting, they'll start accelerating, maybe they're running for a ball or running to make a tackle, they'll drop their shoulders down and immediately drop their center of mass and try and sprint and try and do this initial acceleration period, but they'll almost immediately stand up, and then they're in what will be essentially the maximum speed phase of the race, but they haven't accelerated up to a fast pace at all. So if you're somebody sitting at home and you know you need to get a bit faster for your sport, these drills, both of them, will actually be very beneficial, not only for gaining the extra capacity, not only for gaining that kind of physiological capacity, but for forcing you to stay down in that inclined forward position and actually allowing your legs to put a lot more force into the ground just in that initial 10 meters of the sprint.
So I hope you enjoyed today. S&C coaches reacting. Please do leave any athletes in the comments, as this was one from last week. Obviously, we're aware of Lieke, but it is great to see people leaving the comments because we get much better ideas. Obviously, there's people like swimming or fencing or any number of different sports where someone's like, hey, check out this athlete. They've loads of footage on their social media that you can look at, and we do appreciate all those. So please do leave those below. If you need a program, check out the Sikastrength app on iOS and Android. Maybe you need a strength program, a conditioning program, maybe you need your squat, maybe you need to do some off-season training. You can check those out in the Sikastrength app on iOS and Android, link below. And if you want to come learn from us in person from this S&C work, come to our S&C camp. It's a 3-day camp in Praia de Luz. It's a 3-day S&C camp in Praia de Luz. It's in the south of Portugal. There's an airport an hour away. We'll do 6 sessions and we'll do 3 lectures. So we've got 3 days. We're going to give you as much information as possible. We'll take you through how we like to do conditioning, the strength training, the technique of those exercises, how we program for athletes, and how we might differ that per athlete. We'll do some of the Olympic lift variation so you can get some coaching on that. So whether you're a coach or an athlete, do please join us in Portugal. Email us for details and we will sign you up.